What's a bizarre piece of history that sounds completely made up, but is 100% real? Story 1. A fellow named Alfred Ely Beach, secretly and without government approval, built a demonstration subway based on pneumatic tube technology in 1870. Beach claimed he was just making pneumatic tubes for messages, not humans. This caused a public sensation when it was unveiled, and people flocked to ride it, even though it only had one station. But due to various reasons, it was never pursued. Eventually, it was sealed up and forgotten about. However, when New York actually started to build a subway system in 1911, the workers digging the tunnel broke into the tunnel created by Alfred Beach and found everything just as it was left: a subway car, the tunnel, even the piano used to play music for passengers in the station, frescoes, fancy lamps, etc. They were allegedly dumbfounded. Imagine digging the first subway, only to dig into another much older subway you didn't know about. Story 2. The largest civil war in human history happened in the mid 1800s in China after a man failed the civil service exam, got sick, had a mental breakdown while reading a poorly translated copy of the Gospels, and came to the conclusion that he was Jesus' Chinese brother. While we're on the topic of Chinese rebellions with odd beginnings, during the short-lived Qin dynasty, the first one back in the 3rd century BC, they had very strict laws where you could get executed even from relatively minor offenses. There was a general named Liu Bang who came from a modest background and had been tasked with bringing a convoy of POWs across the country. One night he got drunk, passed out, and woke up to discover half of the prisoners had fled. Then he knew once the imperial court would execute him once they knew so. Having nothing to lose, he freed the rest of the prisoners and rebelled. From there, joining with other renegade officers and taking advantage of the instability at the imperial court, he managed to topple the Qin dynasty and became Emperor Han Gaozu, founding the Han dynasty that would rule China for the next 400 years or so. All this because he overslept because of a hangover. Story 3. A British sailor survived 3 ship sinkings in one day during World War I. To be honest, it was 3 ship sinkings in a single morning. On September 22, 1914, Wenman Kit Wycombe Musgrave started the day aboard the British Royal Navy cruiser HMS Aboukir, which was on patrol off the Dutch coast. The Aboukir was torpedoed by the German U-boat SMU-9. It was mistakenly thought that the Aboukir hit a mine, and the HMS Cressy and HMS Hogue approached to rescue sailors who had jumped into the sea, including Wycombe Musgrave. As he swam to and was getting on board the Hogue, it was torpedoed by the SMU-9. Into the water again, Wycombe Musgrave then swam to the Cressy, and it, too, was torpedoed by the SMU-9. He was eventually found on a bit of driftwood, became unconscious, and was eventually picked up by a Dutch trawler. Nearly 1,400 British sailors died in the 3 sinkings. Musgrave survived World War I and rejoined the Royal Navy in 1939, survived World War II, and lived to the age of 90. Story 4. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, they were met by a Wampanoag Indian who spoke English and had been to England. His name was Tisquantum, popularly known as Squanto, and he had been kidnapped and sold into slavery in Spain years earlier, in 1614. From there, he was ransomed to freedom by Franciscan priests, eventually making his way to England and then back to Massachusetts in 1619, before the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. Not only that, Squanto led them to an old abandoned Indian village that the Pilgrims took over. They didn't have to build anything, it was all there for them. That was Squanto's village. His people had all died of an epidemic while he was a slave in Europe. He was trying to find his people, but instead, he found the Pilgrims and decided to stick around and help them out. Without him, they probably wouldn't have survived their first winter. He played a crucial role in the early meetings because he spoke English and could act as an interpreter between the Pilgrims and the natives. He lived with the Pilgrims for 20 months as an interpreter, guide, and advisor. He taught them how to sow and fertilize native crops. The crops the Pilgrims had brought from England mostly failed. Basically, without him, there would be no Pilgrims. They would have gone the way of Roanoke. Story 5. Judy Cohen was one of the first female aerospace engineers, with her career beginning in the 50s. She worked on the Hubble Space Telescope and the tracking and data relay satellite on the Minuteman missile. She was pregnant and working for the Apollo space program when she went into labor. Before heading to the hospital, she picked up some documents for the problem she was working on. The problem was with the abort guidance system, a crucial component for mission safety, which ultimately played a major role in successfully returning the crew of Apollo 13. She worked on it while in labor at the hospital, solved the problem, and promptly gave birth to Jack Black. Story 6, Wilmer McLean, a Virginia merchant, is notable for his homes being the site of the beginning and the end of the American Civil War. His first home near Manassas was where the First Battle of Bull Run, First Manassas, broke out in 1861, with the house serving as General Beauregard's headquarters. To escape the war, McLean moved his family over 100 miles south to Appomattox Courthouse. Ironically, it was in his new home that General Lee surrendered to General Grant in 1865, effectively ending the war. Story 7, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a Japanese man who was on a business trip at Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. He was working just 3 kilometers away from the blast. He was thrown off by the wave, but survived with minor injuries and no radiation exposure. Obviously shaken, he decided to end the business trip and return home. His home in Nagasaki. His home was again 3 kilometers away from the blast, which again thrashed him. But again he survived, although this time with some radiation exposure. He died in 2010 at 93 years of age. Joe Kiyomiya was a Navajo Indian and U.S. Army soldier in 1941. He was taken prisoner in the Philippines when the war broke out, sent on the Bataan Death March, then tortured by the Japanese as a traitor because, having never seen an American Indian, they thought he was Japanese. After he finally convinced them he was Navajo, they left him alone until the Navajo code talkers showed up in the Pacific. Then he was tortured again for information, but without knowing how the code worked, all he could understand was random strings of Navajo words. Finally, the Japanese gave up on torturing him again and moved him to a secure prison cell in Nagasaki. He survived the atomic bomb blast since he was in a concrete cell deep underground and lived until 1997. Story 8. I sincerely hope this gets attention and isn't buried in the thread because it's a damn good one. The year 1754, if memory serves. When George Washington was a young lieutenant serving the crown in a Virginian militia, he very literally started the French and Indian War by, in a case of mistaken identity, ordering his men to open fire on a band of unarmed French emissaries in the Ohio River Valley. This also led to him leaving military life, essentially after being told by his commanders that he was a failure and would never advance. Meanwhile, the French and Indian, also known as the 7 Years' War, rages for 7 years and involves multiple global forces. As a result of this war, England is broke and needs to replenish their coffers desperately. They do this by taxing the American colonies heavily. This leads to the colonies rising up and beginning the American Revolution, where a now older George Washington ends up being called to lead the revolutionary forces as their general. Note: it has been 2 decades since that day he ordered his men to ambush those French emissaries. America, with the help of France, wins that war and becomes an independent nation. George Washington is almost unanimously elected as the leader of this new nation. So, to summarize, a young George Washington made a career-ending mistake of ordering an ambush which kicked off the 7 Years' War, which led to England being broke, which led to them taxing the colonies, which led to the American Revolution, which led to him returning to military service as the leader of the army, which led to America winning, and then his election to the first presidency, becoming the leader of a new nation. It is the greatest story of failing upwards in history that I can think of. It's absolutely insane and completely true. Story 9. Chicago, in the early days, had a problem with raw sewage as the city was built only a few inches above the lake level, so there was no downhill for sewage to flow. Because of the beef industry, roads were basically small lakes filled with blood and viscera, and people occasionally fell off the sidewalks and drowned. Their solution? Get an army of people with screwjacks and literally raise the entire city 1 story, build a sewer system underneath, then fill it in with dirt. They also took the opportunity to move a few buildings around, including an entire hotel filled with guests. Story 10 HR 23261, aka the American Hippopotamus Bill in 1910, proposed to import hippos into the southern U.S. specifically Louisiana, but good luck enforcing state boundaries for hippos. As a new source of meat and to eat invasive water hyacinths. This obviously was not passed. Not to mention the approx 120 hippos living wild in Colombia thanks to Pablo Escobar that were just kind of left there because removing them is too dangerous. I found out about this a while ago. Oddly enough, I live in a town bordering the mobile Tensas Delta. There were once plans to introduce hippos here too with that bill, which would be more of a problem for the city of Mobile, rather than where I live in the neighboring Baldwin County, as on this side, the area around the delta is hilly, filled with narrow and shallow waterways, and has more rednecks than the other side of the bay. If the hippos had been introduced, Mobile would have been messed up. Story 11. In the 1970s and 80s, the East German government gave steroids to children, without consent from their parents. Under a secret state-sponsored doping program known as State Plan 14.25, the East German regime drugged thousands of athletes, many of them teenagers or even younger, with anabolic steroids like oral turinabol, often disguised as vitamins. The goal? Win as many Olympic medals as possible to show the world that socialism was superior. Some of the most decorated athletes of the era were effectively lab rats, coached, controlled, and chemically enhanced by the state. Many later suffered serious health consequences, including infertility, depression, and organ damage. Some coaches and doctors were even awarded medals by the East German state for their scientific contributions. The full extent didn't come to light until after reunification, when files were opened and victims began to speak out. It's one of the darkest but real chapters of modern German history. Olympic glory at the cost of innocent lives. Story 12. Operation Plumbat. Israel's elaborate scam to steal hundreds of barrels of yellow powder uranium in 1968 after the French cut them off. This stolen uranium became the entire basis for their modern nuclear program. Edit. Another totally unrelated historical incident I'd like to add. Back in the 1860s, a group of Irish immigrants called the Fenians fled Ireland during the UK occupation and came to the USA. After the American Civil War, they came up with the absolutely insane idea to invade Canada in order to trade it back to the British in exchange for Irish independence. They attempted 2 invasions, and both failed miserably. Story 13. People in the Middle Ages took honey mustard very seriously. Like there was clergy involved in the mixing process. But then one guy was just like, hey, maybe we can just make honey mustard whenever we want. We don't have to have a ceremony and a priest. I mean, it's good, but I don't think it needs all that pomp. And then the rest of the town was like, you are wrong, and now you have to die. And yeah, they totally beheaded him. Story 14, World War I started because of an assassination, but it was actually a failed assassination at first. As Franz is driving through the city, he's on a planned route and his killers are waiting for him. They know where he's going to be. The first 2 guys chickened out. The third guy threw a bomb, and it bounced off the car and hit the one behind them. He freaked out and took a cyanide pill, then jumped into the nearby river. The cyanide was too weak and just made him sick. It wasn't deadly. The river was like 2 feet deep at that time. It wasn't deadly. He was captured alive. So Franz gets to his destination and gives his speech, makes jokes about the would-be assassins. Then he talks to his security about getting him the hell out of town safely. They say they have an alternate route planned. No worries. They get in the cars and take off, but nobody told the drivers the new plan. The drivers continue the old route until someone in charge says, hey, turn around. You're going the wrong way. The driver stops right away to turn around, literally right in front of the last assassin who was sitting at a coffee shop. Blam! World War I. Story 15. In 1879, in the kingdom of Buganda, which is now part of Uganda, a British missionary and physician named Robert Falcon witnessed something that completely challenged the expectations of Western medicine at the time. He saw a local healer successfully perform a cesarean section, long before the procedure was considered safe or routine in Europe. The healer used banana wine as both an antiseptic and an anesthetic. The surgical instruments were sterilized by heating them over a fire, and the operation was done with remarkable precision and care. Both the mother and the baby survived without any signs of infection, which was incredibly rare in European hospitals during the 19th century. Falcon was so amazed by what he saw that he recorded the procedure in medical journals, openly acknowledging that the level of surgical skill and hygiene in Africa was far more advanced than many in Europe had ever imagined. It is one of those overlooked moments in history that turns the colonial narrative on its head, showing that advanced, life saving medical knowledge existed across the African continent long before Western medicine caught up. Story 16. During the French siege of Dover Castle in 1216 or 17, the English tunneled out of the castle and attacked the French from behind. It's the only known use of a counter-siege tunnel. During the Titanic disaster, the chef Charles Duchesne kept drinking alcohol while helping the lifeboats and throwing deck chairs overboard. The alcohol in his system kept him warm, which allowed him to survive the freezing North Atlantic until he was picked up by a lifeboat. Story 17. The taking of Roxburgh Castle during the First Scottish War of Independence. James Douglas, known as the Black Douglas to the English, had his men dress in dark cloaks. It was a moonless night and a feast day to boot. The men moved randomly about the countryside so that any guards would think they were cows. It worked. They took the English completely by surprise and recaptured the castle without losing a single man. They then razed the castle on the orders of Robert the Bruce. Story 18. The two fathers of Polish independence, Józef Pilsudski, pro-German socialist, and Roman Dmowski, pro-Russian nationalist, were competing both politically and for the affection of a woman, Maria. Pilsudski won both, and then he left the latter for another woman. He kind of cheated on Poland too by doing a coup and ultimately writing a new constitution that turned the country into an authoritarian state, though not as authoritarian as most. Shout out to Czechoslovakia, the only democracy in the region by the time of the Anschluss of its neighbors. Story 19. In 1865, Minister-President and Prince Otto von Bismarck of Prussia challenged Rudolf Virchow, leader of the opposition Progressive Party, to a duel over an argument they had in Parliament over war funding. Virchow was not only a politician, but also a scientist who made significant discoveries in anatomy and pathology. He was presented with the challenge in his laboratory by Bismarck's seconds, but as the challenged party, he had the choice of spelling weapons. He chose sausages. One of his studies was on the causes of trichinosis in pork. He got two identical sausages, one of which was perfectly safe to eat, and one of which was infected with the trichinosis parasite, which would cause a potentially deadly infection if eaten. He presented them to the seconds with the suggestion that President Bismarck choose and eat one, and would he eat the other? Prince Bismarck's representatives refused the offer, allowing Virchow to maintain his honor. Story 20. The Germans lost their grip on Europe due to a dead homeless Welshman in 1943. The whole story is very elaborate and fascinating. For those who want to read more, you can search for Operation Mincemeat, based on a strategic guide on how to fool your enemy, veiled as a trout fishing guide for secrecy, and co-written by Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond. The British government bought the body of a homeless Welshman who had passed away due to eating bread laced with rat poison. They planted fake plans on the body that indirectly indicated that the Allied forces were going to try and gain a foothold through the Balkans. Their actual goal was to capture Malta and set up a beachhead there for further entry into Europe. At the time, Spain was under the rule of Franco, who wanted Spain to revert from democracy, and thus had unofficially gotten into bed with Hitler, but officially was stating to be neutral. Knowing this, the British dumped the dressed-up body of the homeless man, dressed up in a uniform and with an extensive made-up background story, to throw anyone off the scent of this being a setup, backed up by doctored love letters from a non-existent fiancé, and a receipt for a purchased engagement ring for backstory. The body was dumped off the coast of Spain by submarine, and sure enough, the fake plans were handed over to the Germans, who then allocated 10,000 men away from areas like Malta, which made the Allied invasion much easier in the end. Story 21. In 1970, a whale carcass washed up on an Oregon beach, a big one. After a while, it started to rot and stink up the beach. The city had no idea how to deal with something that big and icky. Their solution? Dynamite. Yes, they stuffed the whale carcass with dynamite and blew the sucker up. They figured the smaller bits would be easier to clean up, but they were wrong. People came from all over the state to see the spectacle. There were news crews documenting the rare occurrence. All were excited to see Moby get blasted to smithereens. Boom went the whale, and his bits of rotting flesh rained down on the town. People were showered with carrion. Cars were smashed by chunks of rancid whale meat. Oh, he made quite a mess. And the town was stinky for some time after. I guess the moral of the story is, don't blow up a whale carcass. Story 22. The Cadaver Synod. In 987 AD, the former Pope Formosus was put on trial by Pope Stephen VI. No big deal. Trials happen all the time. Here's the catch. Pope Formosus died 7 months previous. Pope Stephen had Formosus's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal garments, and put on trial with a deacon speaking on behalf of the deceased pope. The charges were perjury and serving as a bishop, while not a member of religious leadership. Oddly enough, the deceased pope was found guilty. Pope Stephen cut off the 3 fingers used for blessing, stripped him of his papal vestments, and buried him in a pauper's grave. Later, he was dug up a second time and thrown into the Tiber River. Story 23. In Aztec society, if a slave was taken to the marketplace and managed to escape from their owners, run outside the walls of the marketplace and step in, they earned their freedom. But after stepping in, they had to escape to a ruler's palace and prove it happened to a magistrate. All the while this is going on, nobody else is allowed to try to stop the slave from trying to earn his freedom, except for the slave's owners. And the penalty for doing so can include being enslaved. They also had very strict rules for how slaves could be treated, and if it was proven they were mistreated, they could be rewarded with their freedom, and in extreme cases, the owner who mistreated them could be enslaved for doing so. Story 24. In World War II, there was a young general named Mark Clark, who was widely seen as a young genius, one of the fastest to be promoted. He also had a massive ego. During the invasion of Italy, the other big-name generals, Bradley, Patton, Monty, got pulled to prepare for another operation, so it was handed to Clark. He slowly made his way up the country and eventually got to a critical crossroads. If he went one way, he'd cut off a massive amount of German troops, crippling their ability to operate. The other, he'd lead his troops into Rome. Bear in mind, the city had absolutely zero strategic value, and naturally, he took his troops into Rome. The best part? Not only did his mistake lead to years more fighting in Italy, due to the Germans' ability to entrench, but he never got his 15 minutes of fame. The same day he liberated Rome, the Allied forces launched Operation Overlord to begin the liberation of France. Story 25. In the Philippines during the Cold War in the 1950s, the CIA ran this psyop where they had operatives staging crime scene level vampires. They did this because culturally, people from the Philippines were terrified of vampires and had a very entrenched, developed mythology surrounding them. The mission was actually reasonably successful and was thought up by this ad-man turned CIA agent, Edward Geary Lansdale, who had a knack for using his experience in advertising to create psychological operations. He had a talent for it. The CIA Philippines vampire attack op was successful in getting them to retreat. The stuff is all unredacted now and public record.